Good morning, everyone. Nice to see such a good turnout here today. And thanks for the introduction, Tom. So I'd like to start out with a brief refresher, pretty much along the lines that Wendy started with. So we're talking here about natural capital assets on farms, and just like other assets, like a car, like your house, you need to invest in maintaining them in order to produce the services that then produce the benefits that you enjoy. So if you fail to maintain your car, then you're not going to be able to get the transport service that you bought it for. If you fail to maintain your house, you're going to fail to get the shelter service that you purchased it for. And it's the same concept that we're looking here, except that some of these services accrue to the landholder and some of them accrue to others. So how might we think about this? So on farm, many of the services simply are retained on farm. So we're talking here about soil health, pasture condition, things like that. But they're not all monetary or production benefits. It's well known, and there's plenty of studies showing the value of local amenity on farms. In fact, it's one of the key reasons many farmers say they enjoy being farmers, has more to do with the amenity and the lifestyle than the production per se. Some of these are local effects. They can only be produced by you and your neighbours together. And we're talking particularly here about things like pollination, pest oppressive landscapes and things like that. Others accrue further away. So almost everyone here will be familiar with the concept of a watershed or a catchment. So in that sort of scale, you're often looking at water quality. And some are global. So carbon, it doesn't really matter where you emit it, it just contributes to the global pool of carbon in the atmosphere. Now, complicating this, see if it's, that most of these are co-produced. It's not like you can have a widget factory for each of those different scales on your farm. Rather, producing those on-farm benefits may in fact require that you're producing the off-farm benefits. So immediately you start to see the complication when we're talking about who benefits and who pays. You can take one angle to it and ask who should pay. And I think most people would probably agree that landholders should pay to maintain their factory and keep producing widgets from it. But it becomes more complex as we start to scale up. Local effects, well, are you going to pay your neighbours or how do they work? At the higher scales, it's not at all clear that farmers themselves should pay necessarily. On the other hand, it's not at all clear that wider society should pay if in fact they are produced, required for production of what you have the farm for in the first place. And we have a variation in the degree to which existing markets handle these benefits. So with respect to on-farm benefits, it's not as straightforward as you might first think. We have strong commodity markets where landholders are clearly rewarded for the production of your standard wheat, livestock and so on. But the condition of the asset account the natural capital state of that farm particularly well. We have very few, if any, markets at this sort of local effect scale, except to the extent they're taken into account here. And we have some emerging markets at these higher scales, and some of the examples were mentioned by Wendy, but I'll just add a couple of there that are worth noting in this context are reef credits. So this is a water quality market emerging around water quality for the Great Barrier Reef. But we also have other ones such as the Hunter River Salinity Trading Scheme. So these are variable scale water quality markets. Mostly these markets are for services rather than the assets. So unlike with respect to agricultural production where you have both an asset market and a production or a service market, in most cases these are service markets and we don't actually have an asset market. There is some break in that with respect to biodiversity where we are paying farmers to manage an asset, sometimes for such long periods that in effect it's an asset management market rather than a service market. Now this might seem trivial, but it's actually important in understanding what you're in fact paying for and what the incentives for the landholder to manage that are. With relatively little time to speak here, I'm going to focus on one important area and some of the progress in that, and that's making natural capital fungible. Economists, like all professions, like to make up new words. Well, it's not strictly a new word, but one of the words that's important here is fungibility. And fungibility is the ability to measure something in a way that is concrete and allows it to be traded in a market or exchanged. So any of these new emerging markets are going to be reliant on some sort of fungible or definable tradable commodity. Something that relates our benefits and values to the source, or at least assumes a relationship is known there, that's relevant to management at the relevant scale, and that may differ depending on what you're talking about here. Needs to be low cost and widely transferable. There is no good having a different fungible measure for something which is different on every farm. It makes it incredibly difficult to operationalise, and it's pretty much necessary for your trades in a market. So ideally we're looking at something that's robust, repeatable, replicable, transferable, and the last one's actually quite important because many of the metrics you see on this are strictly speaking not comparable across farms. They're not ratio scale comparable, and what that means is that a unit measured on one site may not be the same quantum of service as the same unit measure on another site. So if they're a little bit difficult to understand, but many of the indices you see are quality-oriented indexes, and all they say is something is better when it has a higher score. They do not say that a score of 60 is twice as good or twice as valuable as a score of 30. And that's something to keep in mind because it means you cannot add scores across properties. It also makes it difficult to work out how much you pay to the different people. There's a lot of other things you need in the market too, but these are a game changer. Without this fungibility concept, you're really just sort of guessing in a market. So we have some emerging opportunities. For those of you who've been around a while, I'm sure you're all familiar with the excitement around market-based instruments and market-based approaches around 10 to 15 years ago. The interest has moved on a bit from there, and in particular it's focused on the non-government sector, although government is still important, as Wendy outlined, with a number of major investments, and it will remain that way because of the non-excludability of a lot of these goods. So we're seeing some emerging markets that we've talked about before. We're seeing some thinking around credit and risk management. This largely relates to natural capital and the future agricultural production of assets. So this is the ability of you, having purchased your farm, to continue to pay off your loan in the future. So that's the type of finance and insurance market we're thinking about there. But there's also aspects of these markets simply looking to say, is my investment supporting broader sustainability? They don't actually often come with much of a discount, but they can be useful in other ways in terms of accessing pools of finance. And of course, there's been a lot of fiddling around over in the labelling space, and that can be from the basic stuff, like when you go into the supermarket, am I buying a labelled product? But it also now is penetrating into broader international market access. Again, there's not usually a large premium in this, but it can really change your risk profile if you can access multiple markets worldwide versus if you can only access one with a less certified product. Now, oops, just mixed my notes up. Go back to where I was. There's been quite a bit of development in this sort of fungibility space, this measurability space across these. So we see, I'm trying to point this in your eyes. We can see there's measures developed around, particularly around carbon. I'll come back to that in closing, but there's been quite a lot of work around sort of biodiversity space, not yet an agreed measure, but it is starting to become something that people are happy to talk about being able to measure. Certainly there has been some development around asset condition and productivity risk. CSIRO has been working with one of the major banks in this space, and we're not the only people working in this space with respect to understanding risks to productive asset, both from climate change but also from natural capital condition. And there's been quite a lot of work in supply chain provenancing. I'm going to skip that one. So take me too long. So we're seeing the development of these sort of standardised service measures, standardised asset stock measures, and these product tracing. And in each of those, we're beginning to see what some of the new technologies are allowing us to do in that. So in this space, it's mostly about agreed measures. So it takes a long time for society to move towards an agreed measure. It's not as simple as saying we're going to have a market for CO2, and I'll come back to this slide in a minute, but in fact it's a market for CO2, methane, nitrous oxides, and a variety of other products. And they're all bundled up in what we just call a carbon market. They're all tradable within that. We're seeing quite a good lot of movement around standardised asset stock measures. There's a DAS out here in the foyer, for example, is playing a role in trying to get a sort of data aggregation and data collation in a way that allows for cheap and easy comparison of asset measures across properties. In the product tracing domain, we've sort of got two interplays going on here. On the one hand, there's major trust issues. Markets are pretty reliant on trust. Trust in information at the very least, and there's only some extent to which technology can overcome that. And in particular, many landholders are wary about giving up information about their production process if they don't feel that they're also going to get a reciprocal benefit back. And that's playing into how data is being made available, not made available, and how that might then feed into markets for these products. Yet there are a number of firms and quite a bit of research in understanding how good data governance can facilitate that trust. Finally, the sort of blockchain space is quite a powerful and cheap enabler over in the product stewardship space because it allows you to have a quite high trust, secure chain of provenancing from farm to plate. There are some challenges as well. How do we arrive at these mandated or emergent measures, systems and processes? Sometimes, for example, we forget in Australia that we are a small open economy. We apply the concept of competition at every scale, and then we see we have 30 different measures for something, and we think, well, just fight it out over time. But when we as a country are trying to play into a global marketplace, it can be really beneficial to come out with just one label for what we consider to be appropriately environmentally sustainably produced products. And we have to think through, well, what's the benefit of competition at that scale when we're playing into another level of competition at the global scale? There's also a challenge around consistency with other layers of government processes. So at the farm scale, no farmer is particularly interested or concerned about whether you can get international environmental accounts, but they may well be very concerned about how they're measuring their natural capital on farm. So how do we fit those two things together in a way that doesn't end up with a bunch of measures over here that don't actually aggregate up into something that's useful at the policy scale? So again, just in closing, I think it's worth reminding ourselves just how far we've come in some of this space, particularly with respect to carbon, and then understanding what that might mean for some of the challenges in developing a broader marketplace. As I've already said, carbon is in fact a family of different gases that are traded in one space. We have this concept of scope 1, or direct on-property natural capital. But as I spoke about before, we have this scale issue going on for many of the natural capitals we're talking about here, and to some extent that can be analogous to this idea of the scope 1, scope 2 type relationship about how my production on my farm might contribute to say, for example, a sustainable population base for an endangered species, to a local population, pollination service, to things like that. So understanding that interplay very much feeds into that type of discussion. It won't be directly the same as carbon, but it'll be that type of thing. And then we have this, well, how does it fit into these sort of scope 3 big picture sustainability, and what trade-offs are we willing to make or not make in that area? Thank you.